All right, so as we look at campaigns and elections today, we turn our attention to something that it feels like annually I suggest that this will be something that could be a free response on the AP exam because it is arguably one of the most discussed subjects in political science circles, one of the most discussed subjects in American politics, and that is the concept of redistricting and a secondary concept that we're going to get into a lot today called gerrymandering. So, we're going to hit it today because, again, like I said, annual thing. I think it's going to be a big deal on the AP exam because I'd be disappointed if it wasn't. It's a huge issue. So I turn your attention to this map. This is a map of the congressional districts last decade for the state of North Carolina. Now, looking at that map probably means very little to you. You might know some of the shapes are a little weird, but no big deal, right? Is a big deal. Here's why. If you look at this map, you have to understand a couple things. First thing, the state of North Carolina is almost perfectly balanced politically. Okay? You basically have a distinction of 1 to 4 percentage points. That is to say, in a typical statewide election, the Republican will win 50, 51, 52% of the vote. The Democrat will win 47, 48, 49% of the vote. So it's very close. So given that fact, given that there are, for those who struggle with the counting thing, 13 districts in the state, one might think that, okay, Republicans could control 7 districts to 6. That would be reasonable and proportional. Perhaps they control 8 to 5. That'd be a little on the outside edge of that, but not completely unreasonable. Nope, it was 10 to 3. And really quickly, let me explain to you how this comes to be. I turn your attention to start with to the lines between the district number 2 and district number 4. Notice that the 4th district is all of one county there. That is, I believe, Orange County, North Carolina, a very Democratic county. Then it has a little tiny bit at the bottom of that county there, and then goes into what's called Wake County, which is Raleigh. So you can't even really see the connecting between the two blobs to the left and to the right. You have that little pink blob in the middle of all that blue. And then on top of that, you've got that little tiny strip, and then you got the county to the left in pink. That map was drawn very explicitly to contain all of the Democratic vote in that region in one district. And the way they did that is they split Raleigh, North Carolina, which is a big city that leans Democratic, and Wake County, which is a big, heavily populated county that leans Democratic, into 2 districts. So they took the rest of Wake County, which again leans to the Democrats, and what they did with it, which was kind of sinister, if I dare say, is they took that blue there that is surrounding the pink, that's Wake County, North Carolina, and they connected it to much more conservative territory around it, making the district overall Republican. They did the same thing between the 6th and the 13th district. So if you look, there is a district right in the middle of the state, or there's a county right in the middle of the state that is one part purple and one part kind of that tealy green color. That is Guilford County. That is Greensboro, North Carolina. So what they did here is they took part of Greensboro and put it with some very conservative territory to its west. They took some of the rest of Greensboro and moved it to some very conservative territory to its east. Ergo, therefore, you get 2 Republican districts instead of 1 unified Democratic district. Same thing done down in the corner here between the 10 and the 11. Kind of that light peachy pink, not peach, but the light pinky color. Sorry, I didn't consult my crayon box before I started talking today. And the gold district there. You see that the little pinky district has a bunch of counties that are swung together, and then it goes over to the left and is half of this other county. That other county is Buncombe County, North Carolina. Buncombe County is Asheville. Asheville is like if you drop Berkeley in western North Carolina. It's a very liberal area. But to dilute its strength, the map makers took the western half of Asheville, surrounded it with the mountain districts, which are very conservative. Sorry, you might hear a helicopter going overhead right now. And they took the eastern part of Asheville, the eastern part of North Carolina, or excuse me, the eastern part of Asheville, Buncombe County, and connected it to those counties to its southeast. So this is a process known as gerrymandering, and it will be the focus of our attention today. But first, why do we redistrict at all? Why is this a thing? Well, there's actually a very simple answer to that. The Constitution in Article 1, Section 2 does say that the composition of the House of Representatives has to be determined by population. It's why we have a census. A lot of people don't know that. But the reason we have a United States Census every 10 years is not just so we can have an occasional accounting of our population. I mean, that's a nice bonus, but that's not the reason we do it. We do it instead so that we have an accurate count of each state's population so that we can then go and we can ensure, if you will, that every state gets its proper amount of seats in the House of Representatives. Because as you might recall, if you go back to your studies in Article 2 about, or not Article 2, sorry, Chapter 2 about the Constitution does mandate and dictate that all House of Representatives seats must be determined by population. So each state gets a number of seats determined by its population. Okay. Now, funny thing is, the Constitution does lay out there needs to be a census, does lay out that the composition of the House of Representatives needs to be determined by population. Those are the two things that the United States Constitution does. Here, though, is what it does not do. It does not specify how this will all happen. Okay? For example, later acts of Congress decided things like the size of the House. The size of the House originally, for those scoring at home, was 1 seat at the table, 1 seat in the Congress, for every 30,000 persons. Think about that. That today would require a House of Representatives of over 10,000 members. They would have to, hold their meetings in the hockey arena in Washington, D.C. That wouldn't work very well. So obviously, as time went on, they enlarged the size of the House until 1929. In 1929, they froze it. Said the House of Representatives from this point forward will be 435 members. So as we sit today, each seat in Congress, on average, holds about 750,000 people, 800,000 people, in that range. Okay? Now, another thing they decided later through congressional legislation was this idea that members of Congress would ultimately be determined by single districts, as opposed to, say, what are commonly known as or commonly referred to as multi-member districts. If you are up on your local politics, your city councils, your school boards, those are what are called at-large districts. A lot of places do that. So in the city of Manhattan Beach, it's not like there's District 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the school board. It's anyone in the city of Manhattan Beach wants to run, boom, you can run for the school board, and the top 2 or the top 3 vote getters, depending on the election year, get to sit in that chamber. Cool. That's not how our Congress works. Our Congress works that every district holds 1 member, and each state gets a certain number of districts, thus getting a certain number of representatives. Another thing that later legislation did was figured out exactly what the math would be, what the formula would be for who gets however many seats. So these are all things handled at the level of legislation, not at the level of the Constitution. Now, you might be asking yourself, if you're curious like that, well, wait a second now. Why wouldn't you just give every state, a fixed number of seats in the House? Hey, California, you get 50. Texas, you get 42, whatever, and just let it be. Why go through all this effort and all this money to constantly be adjusting it? Well, the answer to that is actually simpler than you think. The answer is that populations are changing constantly. Since 1960, so just in 65 years, the population of Nevada has increased 6-fold. Meanwhile, West Virginia's real population is smaller now than it was in 1960. We even see this within states. At one point, while Los Angeles County's population has held relatively steady now for 30, 35 years, up a little bit, but not dramatically, out in Riverside and San Bernardino counties, their population was increasing so rapidly that they were adding a new high school every year in those counties because their just population was growing so rapidly. San Francisco's a better example even than LA. LA's had some growth because you have some of those outlying areas like the Santa Clarita Valley in that area, which is all good. But San Francisco, that county, it's a city and a county. It's, I believe the word for that is coterminous. Their population's basically unchanged because if you've been there, you know you can't add a whole lot of housing there. In fact, I'd feel very comfortable saying you can't add hardly any. So their population stayed basically the same. Meanwhile, you have counties like San Bernardino County, Riverside County, Ventura County that have dramatically added population over the last 60 years. So you have to not only change the number of seats each state gets, because Nevada used to be the smallest state in the union. Now it's still in the lower half, but it's past several states. Texas used to be the 8th biggest state in the union. It's now 2nd. New York used to be the biggest state in the union not long ago, by the way. New York was the biggest state of the union in 1970. It's now 4th. So these things are constantly shifting. Our population in this country is fluid. Therefore, you're not only going to have to change the allocation of every state every 10 years, but because of that phenomenon that population shifts within counties. Look at how many people leave Los Angeles and go out to the Inland Empire because it's just cheaper to buy or rent out there. I've had several teaching friends that have left the South Bay that grew up here and are teaching in places like Murrieta Valley and up in Santa Clarita and out in Ventura County. Some moved to Northern California. One of them, one of the best student teachers I ever have, moved to Oregon. So that's the kind of thing that at the end of the day, you have to account for. So not only does the state allocation have to change, but so too do those district lines. So in line with the census, those lines, those district lines, are adjusted, changed, whatever term you want to use, every 10 years. So the process for how this works is good old-fashioned classic federalism. Some of the responsibilities lay with the federal government, and some of them lay with the states. The federal government does the first half of the process, which is conducting the census. The census is entirely a federal program. That determines, at the end of every decade, or actually, I guess if I'm being technical and correct, the start of every decade, that begins the process of determining the population for each state. Then, the federal government will determine, based on a formula that they have, knowing that they have a set population in every state and 435 seats in the House, they can then go ahead and say, okay, This is how many seats every state gets, and it is fluid. It changes every 10 years. For example, in the last reapportionment, which is the term for this, which happened in 2020, for the first time in 100 years, California actually lost a seat in the House of Representatives. Went from 53 to 52. Not because our population shrunk, because it didn't, but it just did not grow as fast as some other places. With that in mind, I think it was 14 states total saw their representation in Congress either increase or decrease by a seat or two. Texas picked up 2. Florida, I think, picked up 1. Oregon picked up 1. Ohio lost a seat. So did Illinois. So too did West Virginia. At the same time, Montana gained a seat. So forth and so on. The federal government's other big responsibility is determining the size of the House. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll repeat again, since 1929, that number has been frozen at 435 members. There are some people, I will be the first to acknowledge, I am among them, who think that should change. I've actually written on the subject that my personal belief is we should go back to the ratio method that they started the Congress with, because our population has stabilized. Our population is not doubling every 25 years like it did at the beginning of our history. Therefore, the way I look at it, or the perspective I draw from it, is that I would argue that if you set the population ratio at 1 for every 500,000 people, you would have a manageable sized House. Today it would be like 660 members, which is more than currently there, but not dramatically so, not life-alteringly so. And when you are able to do that, you get better representation because it's more localized. That's just my opinion. I just thought I'd throw that out there because we're just having a good old time here. So, as I mentioned just a second ago, during reapportionment, faster growing states, states that's population proportionally are increasing rapidly, will gain seats in the House. Slower growing states will, at the same time, lose seats in the House. After the federal government makes those determinations, the process then shifts to the state level. Now, you may say, well, if Singiser, you said only like 14 states are changing their maps, why does every state have to redistrict? Well, go back to something I told you a couple slides ago. Even within a state, population shifts. So those districts no longer apply. I know in Arizona, after the 2010 census, there was one district that had gone from 700,000 down to 688,000. At the same time, there was another district in the state that had gone from 700,000 to 1.4 million because it was in suburban Phoenix. So, yeah, you got to change that up because now it would no longer be proportional representation in terms of equal representation in the House because over the course of 10 years, one district got twice as big as the other. So even within states that don't gain or lose seats, you got to redraw the maps. And that is the responsibility of the states. So once the federal government determines how many seats each state gets, the process shifts to the state government where they'll determine the shapes of the districts. Now, to be clear, this can be done in a variety of ways. Some states, most states I would argue, the state legislature draws the map. In some states, California is one of them, they have an independent commission that does their map drawing for them to take the influence of the state legislature out of the equation. We're not the only one that does that, by the way. Iowa does that. I want to say that Arizona had a commission-drawn map, I believe. I want to say Oregon did. A handful of states have commissions. Because it's such a political process and because it's such a controversial decision-making process, there are quite a few maps in place right now that were drawn by courts because the maps that have been drawn were ruled illegal. Literally, in this calendar year, that happened in the state of Wisconsin to immense consequences. The Republican majority in Wisconsin had drawn a set of maps that, even though Wisconsin's a 50-50 state, Trump won it in 2016, Biden won it by about the same margin in 2020. The Wisconsin Republicans had a 21-12 majority in the Senate, maybe 22-11, I think it was, and something like a 63-36 majority in the House. Wholly disproportionate. So a court ruled that the map was a violation of the rights of a number of people in that state, that it was drawn for clear political effect, broke up communities of interest, minimized, that's the proper word, the voting rights of people of color by splitting them among separate districts, a bunch of different violations, and the net result was they were ordered to draw a new map. The state of Wisconsin tried to draw a very similar map. That map was also ruled unconstitutional, and the court basically said, okay, we gave you one chance. You couldn't draw a fair map. We gave you a second chance. You did the same damn thing. So we're going to take it out of your hands. We're going to basically hire someone to draw the map for us. And the map goes, now you guys, again, I've said this a bunch of times on a bunch of these different notes, you guys will have perfect knowledge of the 2024 elections. I'm recording this in July of 2024, so I don't know what's going to happen, but I can tell you that the map went from a map where Republicans had a majority in 63 out of 99 seats to one where it's 50-50, 50-49 to be exact. So the Republicans go from having no chance of losing their seat in Congress to a situation where the state legislature, to a position where they could be in real danger. We see this at the congressional level as well. Among the states that had to redraw their maps this year was the state of Alabama had to do it, and the state of Louisiana, because they lost civil rights lawsuits in both of those states. The state of New York and the state of North Carolina replaced court-drawn maps with legislative-drawn maps. So, it used to be you drew one map at the start of 10 years, and that was a ballgame. You didn't do it again. Now, because this process has become so controversial, has become so fraught with dispute, we're in a position now that, because there's so many allegations of the rules being violated, maps are being drawn every cycle, which is not the way it was intended to be, but it's the way it's become because this is so important. You can take control of a state legislature just by how you draw the maps. Now, there's some states you can't change the balance of power. I've tried. I tried to do a state legislative map of California that would give the Republicans the control of the state legislature. Couldn't do it. Best I could do was get it down to, I think it was 50 seats or 48 seats for the Democrats and 32 for the Republicans. So there's not enough Republicans. But in states that are competitive, this is a big deal. And of course, if you take each state and make them into the amalgamation that's Congress, in a Congress that's so narrowly divided as ours is, it becomes a huge deal. So there are basically three rules. Let's get to the rules real quick. First of all, districts must have essentially equal population. At the federal level, it has to be as close to exact as you can get. Obviously, you can't split the people in the same house. So you might have a deviation of one. But that's it. State legislatures, the courts have given a lot more deference to keep communities together and things like that. There, the deviation allowed is a few percent. So one district could have 9,820 and the other one could have 10,400, and it's not illegal. The second rule is they must be contiguous. It has to be all in one piece. You can't draw a congressional district saying, Manhattan Beach is a lot like Palo Alto, California, so we're going to make a district of Manhattan Beach and Palo Alto, California. It doesn't work like that. They have to all be connected to one another, contiguous. And the third one, and this is by far the most routinely violated, is something called compactness, which is that they should all relatively be in the same place. And that's the one that's most often broken. Observe a map that was actually ruled unconstitutional back in 2018. This, friends, is the Pennsylvania 7th Congressional District in the suburbs of Philadelphia. It has been called the Roadrunner Kicking Wile E. Coyote in the Butt District because that's exactly what it looks like. It is a district that was drawn by the Republican state legislature of Pennsylvania to ensure that there would be at least one and hopefully more than one Republican elected in the Philadelphia area. Because for those who don't know, Philadelphia, the city, super Democratic. But these suburban counties, Chester County, Delaware County, Montgomery County, Bucks County, have become consistently, steadily more Democratic over the last 2 decades. So, here's what they did. For those who do not know, the Roadrunner part, the right, excuse me, the rightward part of the district, that's right outside the Philly suburbs. If you can see it large enough, you can see Philadelphia is just to the east of that. That area is shifting very quickly from red to blue. So they strung together all the neighborhoods and communities that still had some Republicanism left in them. But if they made just a nice compact map of that area, it would vote Democrat, because all those areas that are currently in white are all heavily Democratic, and in some cases heavily African American. So, here's what they did. Where the Roadrunner's foot is, into the backside of old Wile E. Coyote, that extends out about 75 miles inland from Philadelphia. Much more conservative territory. So about half the population is the Roadrunner, about half the population is old Wile E., and that half that is Wile E. Coyote is much more conservative. So that district as a whole votes Republican. That is what we call gerrymandering, okay? And what the court eventually ruled, which was a completely reasonable ruling on their part, the court rules that, you know what? We are willing to accept some levels of gerrymandering, some levels of manipulation of maps for political gain. But this is ridiculous. I mean, that's essentially what the court said. The court said that there are limits to this behavior and that the state of Pennsylvania badly exceeded those limits by drawing a map like this. That there was no contiguity. There was, because they're just a tiny little strip, maybe, as wide as a mile connecting the two segments of the district. There's certainly no compactness, and they ordered a redrawn map. And they did not give the legislature the opportunity to do it. They handed it over to a court, and actually the court submitted requested public input, and actually a friend of mine helped redraw the map, which is kind of cool. This process we just watched is called gerrymandering, and that court, in the eyes of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in 2018, so badly violated the rules of how districts could be drawn that they actually went and ruled it illegal. These are known as gerrymanders. Now, this is named after an early American politician in Massachusetts named Elbridge Gerry. Yes, Gerry, it's called a gerrymander. Why is it not called a gerrymander? Who the heck knows? I don't know either. It doesn't make any damn sense. But a gerrymander is a nickname given to a district map drawn mainly for partisan or political impact. So if we go back to the beginning, and I'm not going to, but you know what? Yeah, let's not do that. If you go back to that North Carolina map at the beginning and just rewind your video, you can see a classic example of gerrymandering. Splitting up those heavily Democratic areas in order to ensure that Republicans would win both those districts is a classic example of gerrymandering. Okay? Since in most states, partisans are in charge of drawing these maps, most are done by state legislatures, then approved by the governor. Like I said, a small handful are done by independent commissions, but very few. Since partisan politicians are the ones drawing the maps, state legislatures, a governor, gerrymanders are quite common. So, for example, and by the way, it transcends party. The two examples I gave, because they're the two visually most egregious, were Republican. But you can go look at, actually, and I just don't have an image of it on my computer, you can go look at the current congressional map for the state of Illinois, which was drawn by the Democrats in Illinois, and see something exceptionally similar. You could look at the map for Maryland, also drawn by Democrats, and be like, why is the western part of Maryland, which is super conservative, instead of going just straight east into the suburbs of Baltimore, which are they're moderate, why instead does it take a sharp southward turn into the suburbs of Washington, D.C. that are like 90% Democratic? So there's That's gerrymandering. That is, I'm not drawing this map just to have clean, equal representation. I'm drawing a map for one reason alone, and that is to maximize the opportunities for my party. So take what I'm talking about with Illinois and Maryland. Now, Illinois and Maryland are not swing states the way that North Carolina and Pennsylvania are. No one's targeting Illinois or Maryland in the presidential election. The Democratic nominee, and I say that because it's already changed once in this election, who knows. But for the moment, Kamala Harris, she'll win Illinois by 15 at least. And she'll probably win Maryland by 25. That said, those maps are 8 seats in Maryland, 6-2 Democratic. That's a little beyond proportion for sure. And Illinois is even more egregious. There are 17 districts in Illinois, and it is 14-3 Democratic. So definitely not proportional. Okay. So, since we understand what gerrymandering is, let's close by looking at the different ways in which it can be executed. And there's effectively 2 ways. And they have lame-ass nicknames, I know. But they're called packing and cracking. Packing is when you stuff all of a party supporters into one district. You see an example of packing in the state of Mississippi. What Mississippi Republicans did when they drew the congressional map there is they took, Mississippi is a state that's 40% black. They took most of the black voters in the state and shoved them into one district. It is the 2nd district. 2nd district combines the Delta with Jackson, with some counties in the interior that are heavily black, and it creates a 66% black district. Didn't need to be that way. In fact, we saw lawsuits on this exact same racial packing concept in Alabama and Louisiana, where the courts ruled that they had very explicitly violated the law. So, I got to tell you, I'm very surprised that Mississippi has not been struck down similarly. Very surprised. Anyhow, what that did by putting so many of the black voters who are reliably Democratic in one district is it made the other 3 districts reliably Republican. Okay? Now, an example of cracking, North Carolina. The map we saw at the beginning of the notes. Cracking is, okay, we're going to take this one county that's super Democratic, split it between 2 districts, and connect it to more conservative turf. That's cracking. Another classic example of cracking is in the state of Texas. In Texas, at one point, Travis County, which is where Austin is, Austin's a very liberal part of Texas. Okay, Texas leans red for sure. Not as strongly as it used to, but still quite red. But there are exceptions. Dallas is an exception. San Antonio is an exception. El Paso is an exception. And the biggest exception of them all is Austin. You could easily, and I do mean easily, draw 2, maybe even 3 districts out of Austin that would reliably vote Democratic. Not maybe even say 3 or 4. Right now, there are 2. How'd they do it? Well, first of all, they connected a district between Austin all the way down to San Antonio. That's a great example of packing. Just take all these Democrats on a 125-mile corridor, throw them all into the same district. But really, above all else, Travis County is an example of cracking because I want to say this county of about 1 million, 2 million, 3, good-sized county. Maybe more than that now. It might be closer to 2 million. Could be in 2 districts, could be in 3. I think there are 5 districts that come out of that county. So there's some pretty liberal parts of Austin that are connected to the west, to the hill country, which is super, super Trumpy. I have family there. Very Trumpy. So that would be an example of cracking. So the reason why I think this is a hot subject is now it comes up every election. Because the reality of the situation is, why it matters, and it doesn't matter whether it is a Democrat or it's a Republican pursuing it, is democracy, elective democracy, takes a pretty sizable hit when a political party can basically do whatever the heck they please and feel no repercussions from that, because the way that the maps are drawn makes it impossible for them to lose. Um, Proportionality and competitiveness are what in many ways drive elective democracy. The idea of you have to represent the people well or you will lose your ability to represent them goes out the window when you draw the maps in such a way to ensure that you win no matter what. It's a way of rigging the game, to use a way overused cliche. And so the question becomes, what remedies are going to exist? Is the court going to step up and rule that gerrymandering, they've already ruled on gerrymandering, as you guys are going to note in some case studies you're going to do. They've already noted some restrictions and some conditions on gerrymandering, but will they just ban the practice altogether? So far, the indication for that is not great. The court has not shown a willingness to do that. But will they become more aggressive at calling out, particularly at the state Supreme Court level, the gross violations of same? Okay, that's that. Enjoy your day, evening, morning, whatever the heck it is you're doing, and whenever the heck it is you're doing it. And we will talk next time.